Collier, Professor of Economics and Public Policy at Oxford, and the author of The Future of Capitalism, award-winning, best-selling, a new book about the future of capitalism. Paul, the introduction to your book is very personal. You begin the book, or you dedicate the book, to your cousin Sue, and with the words, diverging lives, converging anxieties. Picture of two 4-year-olds growing up in Sheffield. Tell me the story of that.
Yeah, so we were both born into, modest circumstances. My mum and dad both left school when they were 12, and I think it was the same for Sue. And we both got to state grammar schools. And then when she was 14, when we were 14, her father died, and her father had been a pretty authoritarian father. And with the loss of that sort of authority figure, her life derailed. So as a teenager, she became, a teenage mother. And that echoes down the generations. So both her daughters became teenage mothers. And that was the divergence between us. Meanwhile, I'd been, the fluke that got from my background to Oxford as an undergraduate, and then as a graduate, and then joined the faculty.
What does a teenage mother and a successful, self-made, working-class boy who ends up at Oxford and becomes a world-famous academic, what does that have to do with capitalism?
Because what was missing in our lives was the safety nets that would put her life back on the rails. And so divergence having started with just one little random event, one random death, it then got worse and worse and worse. That is a metaphor for what's been happening over the last 40 years or so across Western societies. You've seen two new divergences open up and get wider and wider. And as it happens, I straddle both of them. So one is the divergence between the people who had a really good education and the people who didn't. And the people who had a good education, like me, on the back of that education, we get specialist skills that become more and more valuable. And the people who didn't, for whatever reason, have a good education, so dropped out of school, they go into manual skills, and those manual skills then get less and less valuable as the growth of complexity and technology undercut them. And so that's one of the rifts between the well-educated and the less well-educated.
Paul, you and Sue were both born in Sheffield in 1959. Are you nostalgic for a previous age when capitalism was fairer?
I don't do nostalgia.
Why?
I don't want to go back, because the Earth is a spaceship hurtling forward into the unknown, and we better make the best of that and not try and cling to the past. But I do think that we had a fairer system post-war. The war forged a sense of social solidarity, which then produced
the Second World War.
The Second World War. And that was so the period just from 1945 for maybe 20 years was a miraculous period where the successful people felt themselves to belong to the same community and society as the less successful, and were willing to pay and to help. And that's what we've lost.
What happened? What was the divide? Was it the Thatcher-Reagan revolution?
As you say, the Thatcher-Reagan revolution could be summed up in the idea, sort of, you deserve it, and that markets will deliver all boats will rise. And all we need to do is make profits for ourselves, and the market will sort it out, will lift all boats. That was especially coming out of Chicago, Friedman's doctrine that the only responsibility of a firm was to maximize shareholder value. And that became dominant in business. It was a new doctrine. Friedman promoted that first in about 1970, and it spread through business schools. It's just this year been repudiated by the America's Business Forum and by Britain's Institute of Directors.
What word would you use to describe that? Is it neoliberalism, or is there a better word?
Well, I think of it as economic man. Economic man, which we teach in economics, I'm ashamed to say. Economic man is greedy, lazy, and selfish.
Isn't that the credo of your trade? And by arguing against it, you're essentially destroying the science of economics?
I'm certainly challenging the science of economics. We don't have to have a model in which people are greedy, lazy, and selfish. Of course, we all are a bit greedy, lazy, and selfish.
Even you?
I recognize that in myself, of course. It's the worst angels of my nature, right? But to say that that's all I am, or that that's all you are, Andrew, no, right? It's a travesty of what we are.
Can't we historicize this, though? Because often the Friedmanite Chicago school is presented in a historical vacuum. Weren't they responding themselves to the ideology of Bolshevik communism, to Marxism, and to a stronger and stronger welfare state?
They were certainly reacting to, so one of the sentiments in it was libertarianism, and that actually came both from the right and the left. And libertarianism was a pushback from an overly strong state. And so what we get, partly because of the sort of Friedman doctrine that firms don't have any obligations, and partly coming from the left, the idea that families are actually not healthy systems of reciprocal obligations, but chains on people's liberty. And so we get an attack on firms as morally load-bearing from Friedman. We get an attack from the left on families as morally load-bearing. And where the obligations go to, they go up to the state. And so the state then has the challenge of how do you control all these greedy, lazy, selfish individuals? And the answer comes from economics. Economics thinks it solves the problem of how do you get this awful creature, economic man, to behave. And the answer is you monitor him like a hawk and give him carrots and sticks on that monitored behavior. And so we all get put in this prison of contracts with highly specified behavior tied to incentives and monitored behavior.
And you call this utilitarianism?
It is economic man it is utilitarianism because all the obligations are at the top, run by some saints at the top. Where the saints come from, nobody specifies, but the saints are in charge of maximizing social utility. That's the utilitarian thesis.
And you trace this back to Jeremy Bentham with his sort of algorithmic analysis of humanity. Yes, you can
trace it even further back to Plato. Plato decided that the only way to run a society was with guardians. Platonic guardians, they're called. He thought they should be philosophers. Economists put him right there, right? And so by the time of Bentham and Mill, these weird people who are completely asocial.
Well, but Mill did argue back. He had his own mental breakdown and then freed himself from utilitarianism.
Yeah, so he managed to escape, yeah. I don't think Bentham did, right? When Bentham died, he had himself stuffed so that he could sit and preside over meetings even when dead. Right? You've got to be seriously weird to want to be stuffed to preside over meetings, right?
To put it politely, you've trashed the Benthamite utilitarian interpretation of mankind or of humanity. What's yours?
So, my interpretation of mankind, which comes absolutely strongly from modern evolutionary biology. Now, let me do a little detour into that. Modern evolutionary biology has shown not that we're inevitably economic man, but that economic man is virtually extinct because the conditions of the last million years were so hostile that we only survived if we formed groups which supported each other mutually. And economic man was just too untrustworthy, too unreliable to be included in these groups. So economic man survived as a tiny sliver. We call them psychopaths. And then, so what does a good society look like? It doesn't look like a society of psychopaths which are held together by this complex structure of monitoring and incentives. That's the world of modern economics, right? In fact, our whole edifice of theorems tries to answer the questions, under what circumstances would a society made up only of psychopaths not fall apart? The answers we come out with are actually pretty unlikely circumstances. Right? So what's success like? Success is mutuality. Success is a sense of belonging to a community and sharing obligations with others. And this is what capitalism has always managed to produce to salvage its derailments.
Does that make you a communitarian?
Yes, it does.
Embrace that term?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, if I could just describe to you the first derailment of capitalism, which happened in the 1840s in the cities where I grew up, because that was the birth of modern industrial capitalism. And by the 1840s, people were flocking into these cities like Sheffield, and they became the nearest thing we've had to hell on earth outside the context of war. Life expectancy in cities like Sheffield fell to just 19 years. On average, you were dead 19 years after you were born. Right? Why? Because health collapsed. There was no public infrastructure, and so drinking water got mixed up with sewage. So I'm going to take you to the most booming city in the whole of Europe in the 1840s, and it's Bradford. Yeah? And I'm going to take you to 1849, and cholera has broken out. People are dying by the hundred. Right? And Bradford is run by Mr. Big. He's called Titus Salt. He's the biggest industrialist in the city. He's the equivalent of a billionaire. He's politically very powerful. He's the city's mayor, and he's the city's member of parliament. Right? So he's Mr. Big. And there he is, running this city, and cholera breaks out. And it seems to have actually seared his soul, because he becomes the first billionaire philanthropist on earth. And he gives away his entire fortune in two ways. One is he recognizes his obligations to his workforce. And so he builds the first purpose-built town for a workforce on earth. He's Titus Salt, it's called Saltaire, now a World Heritage Center in recognition. And then the rest of his fortune he gives to the citizens of Bradford to clean up the city. That was responsible capitalism responding to these new anxieties.
So you talked about him searing his soul. Let's fast forward more than 150 years to contemporary capitalism. And you say in the beginning of the book that you're trying to maintain your cool head as an economist, but your heart has been seared by contemporary capitalism. What has happened?
I think of us as being in the third derailment of capitalism. The first was that, a health crisis. The second, obviously, mass unemployment in the 30s. This third one, these two big social cleavages between the booming cities and the broken cities, between the educated and the less educated. Each time capitalism derails, it's a different derailment. It's different anxieties are generated.
Interesting that you use the railway metaphor.
Yeah, it's a derailment. And this time it's a slow derailment. The health crisis was a pretty fast derailment. The unemployment in the 1930s was a head-on crash. But this derailment is different in that we've not responded by putting it back together. It's just got worse and worse and worse. if I could just take us back to the 1840s for a minute. Right?
On that train.
Yeah, on that train. People were dying like flies, right? I'm going to take you a few miles from Bradford to another town called Rochdale. And there in Rochdale, families were facing the same anxieties. But this time it was ordinary families who did something about it. They grouped together, mutual support. They built obligations towards each other. And that was the world's birth of the cooperative movement, which has now spread all around the world in this massive organization. But the cooperative movement was the same spirit as Titus Salt, recognizing obligations, but building obligations to each other, and those obligations supporting rights. So, for example, in Britain, the cooperative movement became the biggest funeral director in the country, because if you were dying like flies in the 1840s, your top worry was, do I get a funeral? Or am I chucked in a pauper's grave? So that was then. You got both families and firms recognizing obligations. We fast forward to now, and what do we see? We see the most disgusting behavior of firms, with chief executives massively elevating their own pay relative to others. And that means that the chief executives can no longer credibly use the word we. A chief executive of a company should be setting the norms, the culture of the whole organization. And the norms and the culture of a good firm should be to find profitable solutions to people's problems.
What else needs to change to fix capitalism? You've written in a very interesting way about cities, suggesting that they are these places for the privileged, for the educated, but also they may be the problem, but they may also be the solution.
So we live in cities. There are cities and cities, right? Sheffield's a city. It became a broken city. London, the metropolis. And over the last 40 years, what we've seen is the metropolis pulling ahead of the provinces. Nowhere more dramatic than Britain and America. And that's very unhealthy, and it's unnecessary. It's perfectly possible to have economic success widely distributed around a country. Germany's actually managed to do it. So people in Munich don't wish they were in Berlin. People in Hamburg don't wish they were in Strasbourg. It's a widely distributed. And what they've done, they've designed a system in Germany which actually helps local cities to thrive. So there's a lot of decentralization of political power. There's a very active local business community. And there's a range of policies that have actually supported spatially distributed business. So within reason, we know how to do that. But we also know that if a city breaks, as Sheffield did, it doesn't revive automatically. What happens is it fills up with junk jobs, warehousing, distribution stuff that are low skill. And so the population gets off the skill escalator. And so you need active public policy that creates and coordinates a cluster of knowledge-intensive firms to get back into the city. That takes active public policy.
Doesn't economics, though, ultimately fix that? Because as real estate in New York or San Francisco or London becomes more and more affordable, people will eventually go back to Detroit or Sheffield.
They go back in ones, but the important thing is whether you get a cluster of knowledge-intensive firms. The clusters happen. They happened in Silicon Valley. Why did that happen? Probably because of Stanford, right? You get a really top world-class university, and so the knowledge clusters.
So like Oxford or Cambridge as well.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. So if left to itself, the market will come up with these rather simplified narratives that everything's got to happen in America. It's shriveled to 7 cities. MBAs basically want to work in one of 7 cities. Now that's not a healthy situation at all, right? People live in many more than 7 cities. And so the narratives need to be reset, And that takes active public policy. The market won't do it. The market actually makes things worse.
What's your sense of a more traditional public policy recalibration of capitalism, higher taxes, essentially social revenge against billionaires? Do you believe in this idea?
So I believe, I'm not wild about a state as the great redistributor, right? What really needs to be redistributed is productivity. And so, yes, we're going to have to tax the highly successful, but what we should use that money for is not to transfer consumption to the unsuccessful, but transfer productivity to the unsuccessful. Because everybody, we're not fundamentally these greedy people who just define ourselves by consumption. For most of us, our model of life is not, I want to lay on a beach and do nothing and be fed grapes or something, you know. For most of us...
Speak for yourself.
Andrew, you are here working, and why are you doing that? Because it's purposive, right? And the same for me, right? So, and we're not weird. Most people are like that.
We're not psychopaths, in other words.
We're not, and nor are most people. Most people want to be in a position in life where they can contribute, where they can help feed their families, where they can help contribute to their communities. And for that, they need to be productive. And to be productive, jobs need to be in the place where they belong, productive jobs, which is about the public policy to relocate skilled jobs. And those people need to be equipped to do those skilled jobs. And that is the long haul.
The challenge and the opportunity, but I don't know where it comes from or how we introduce it, is coming up with a political vehicle for your communitarian ideology, this initiative to rethink economic man and build a society around community.
Yeah, absolutely.
And where does that come from?
So the book is a plea to re-establish what I call the hard centre. And by the hard centre, I mean a centre that is not just a mishmash of nice-sounding platitudes, but has some strong principles of relinking obligations to rights. There shouldn't be rights floating about without obligations to meet them. And each person in society should recognize that they have both rights and obligations, duties, if you like. So our politics, both on, I think the left-right spectrum is actually increasingly outmoded, really. The right metric is not state versus individual. It's not that, it's that. It's getting back to a widely distributed set of organizations that are all capable of being morally load-bearing, whether it's a firm, whether it's a family, whether it's a civil society and a community. They all need to be morally load-bearing.
This is all very well, but we have elections in the UK and the US in which your team, your view of the world, is barely represented in political terms. Why?
Because the debate has been crowded out by these strident extremists. In Britain, 1% of the voting age group is members of political parties. Just 1%. We are ruled by the 1%. Who are those 1%? They're the most extreme ideologues in the society. Right?
So where does the change come from?
Oh, the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
But not through traditional political channels. Do we need to rethink the very idea of politics in this 21st century communitarian future?
Yes, I think we do. I mean, in Britain, it's absurd that not only have we got the extreme 1% who are the only group that choose who the leaders of the parties are. But it's also age segregated, so that the part of the 1% that chooses the Labour Party is children, and the part of the 1% that chooses the leader of the Conservative Party is geriatrics. So we've got the most extreme children and the most extreme geriatrics choosing our two political leaders, and then the rest of us get to choose, do you want, vegan or veal? I mean, it's a sort of crazy political structure. We can do a lot better than that. We once did. We can get back to a pragmatic politics where the discourse is communitarian. But today we haven't had it. We haven't had it because the centre ground has been soft. It's been a centre of apology, compromise, and a bit of populism rather than of hard principles.
But how do we harden that centre in very concrete ways?
First of all, we changed the voting rules for the election of leaders. Britain used to have a rule that leaders were picked by members of parliament. And because members of parliament have to get the votes from everybody, members of parliament are much more moderate than the tiny group which is the extreme. So we actually moved from leaders being chosen by members of parliament to leaders being chosen by the activists in the parties on the grounds of democracy. It was an incredible abuse of that word democracy. We weren't giving the vote to more people, we were giving it to many fewer and the most extremes. Right? If your congressmen and senators in America had picked the leader of the Republican Party, do you think they'd have picked Mr. Trump? I rather doubt it. Right? So there are simple rule changes that we could get back to a more moderate politics. And
so what you're really saying is that fixing democracy and fixing capitalism are essentially the same thing.
I think if we don't fix democracy, we'll struggle to fix capitalism, because some of the rules around capitalism really need to change. And if we don't do that, if we don't fix capitalism, it will explode into social disorder. We've seen the mutinies responding to prolonged neglect, the mutinies of Brexit, of Trump, of the Gilets jaunes, of the AfD in Germany. These are mutinies due to the prolonged neglect of these widening social rifts. We've let that happen for 40 years. We can't, it's just too dangerous to let it keep happening. So yes, we need substantial political change, which will then enable us to do substantial change of the way in which capitalism is run. Capitalism needs to work. It's the only system that is capable of delivering rising living standards, but it doesn't work on autopilot.